The Chinese economy is not doing well. As I think this is a good time to your point about how the UN depends on foreign investment.
Yeah, I mean, China's entire economy. Well, the fundamental problem with the Chinese economy is that state-controlled economies don't do well because they squash innovation and creativity and competitiveness, and therefore it's a very inefficient system.
I mean, they basically create giant bureaucracies to continue running.
Right,
yeah.
and so bureaucracies are by nature inefficient, and so.
And then if you have like a politically motivated, like an ideologically motivated bureaucracy, I think that's also even worse because then people are making decisions according to saving their skin politically and not making decisions.
I think we're kind of seeing that in the U.S. with all the DEI stuff,
where a lot of it is kind of essentially decision making that's not in the best interest of the business or
the consumer.
Yeah, you get these ESG scores, so it's like this measurable thing. So companies like need to get investment by like fulfilling these ideological things like DEI, and so they put emphasis on this because that's how they get investment.
But like the weird thing is that they self-impose that ESG stuff. Yeah, like anyway.
Yeah. Well, so a simple example of why communist systems are inefficient is centralization. So like the idea, just to illustrate this really simply, you have 1,000 farmers who don't get to own their crops. It all belongs to the central government. And so they have to send the crops in, put them on a train, they send them out, and then those get redistributed across the country. So you're basically sending them in, there's a bureaucracy, and they take a cut because they need to pay for the bureaucracy and feed those people, and then they send it back out. So now you've lost some to the bureaucracy and some to the transport, right? So even if there's no corruption at all, you have a major efficiency problem compared to farmers being able to grow and eat their own food, all right? So that's why, this illustrates why communist systems are economically not particularly viable. So how do they sustain is by getting foreign investment. At least that's what the Chinese Communist Party realized after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they kind of knew this before.
They knew this before. They were running out of money in the 70s. This is why reform and opening up happened.
Right. I mean, there was an absolute economic disaster under Mao for many different, basically his whole time was a disaster. There was the Great Famine, Cultural Revolution. Just nothing got done. So yeah, they were, Deng Xiaoping and his Southern tour in the 80s, was all of this. Or actually late 70s, I think. Yeah, the Gaiga Kaifeng was 78 or 79.
So, reform and opening up started in 78.
Right. And so they needed this sort of IV line to sustain them. And they have done an amazing job of tricking the West into thinking that if they just put money into China, they're, I'll win big if I invest in China. And
there's 1 billion customers in China. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even just a fraction of that.
Yeah. And so what's funny is that for the great majority of foreign companies that invested in China, they're not getting a positive return.
It's interesting. There was an article in the Financial Times last week about how foreign firms are having trouble pulling their money out of China.
Oh, surprised that the CCP wouldn't want them to do it. And this goes back to the currency thing, which is that China essentially pegs its currency to the US dollar. And now they say they've let it float for the last, couple decades. But the reality is that it's only allowed to float like 2% of whatever the target the government sets.
It's pegged to a basket of currencies.
Right.
But
it's a basket that they keep like secret and control the value of. So it's stupid.
The point is that the CCP ultimately controls the value of the yuan.
Right. But in order to do that, they have to have large foreign currency reserves so that when there are fluctuations in other currencies, they can, the Chinese authorities can maintain the value.
But foreign investment is at a 30-year low in China, which is great because there's all these state-run media articles coming out about how, it's just a Western lie, everything is great. But like that data comes from China's official Bureau of Statistics.
And you know that if that is what the Bureau of Statistics is saying, then the reality is much worse.
Right. It's actually the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, which is what David
Oh,
Day,
right.
who we had on our show,
SAFE.
talked about. Yeah, SAFE. And they're like, and the way David Day put it, I thought was really interesting, which is that there's essentially two currencies. There's like the one that they trade with the West, and then there's their
Yes.
fake useless script that they
the
issue in China.
internal domestic yuan and the versus the offshore
Right.
yuan. Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting way to think about it as well. But basically, yeah, it's a system propped up by lies, and also a system propped up by foreign investment. And so the CCP is freaking out about the loss of foreign investment, but they're not exactly addressing the reasons for the loss of foreign investment. And I think I'm surprised it took this long, but foreign companies are realizing how difficult it is to do business in China.
Only so many of your executives can get arrested in China before you start being like, maybe it's not a good idea to be there.
Only so much of your intellectual property be stolen by a Chinese company that creates a knockoff that's sold for cheaper and drives you out of business.
Right. I mean, remember, it was a long time ago, like a decade ago, the executive from Rio Tinto, the Australian mining company, was imprisoned. And like, even though he was an Australian citizen, he was ethnically Chinese, right? And then people were like, oh, this is bad. I'll issue a statement, but I'm going to keep doing business in China.
Yeah. Or even more recently, Apple, their iPhone market is huge in China. It's down precipitously this year, while sales for China's Huawei, which is basically kind of the same, looks like the same phone, are way up. Is there a state hand in that, do you think?
It's just kind of like this was always going to happen at some point. It's just like, how long is that, how long can you make it in China before you will be edged out by a domestic Chinese company? Because that is what the Chinese state wants.
Right.
Like, it's never going to let Apple be the biggest cell phone, manufacturer in China. It's never going to let a foreign company be the biggest.
Right.
Yeah.
And because, it is common for executives and investors to have some element of greed and short-term thinking, it makes financial sense for a lot of them to have invested in China. And I'll give an example. Like, let's say you're put in charge of some, publicly listed manufacturing company, and you think, oh, I'm going to go to China and set up, it's going to be cheaper and all these things. And so the revenue projections, your profit projections go up, right? And so you're thinking, I'm going to be CEO for 5 years. I know that by going to China, it's going to increase the value of my stock, and I'm going to make more money. I'm going to make more bonuses. Whatever that cash is, I get to keep, right? And I can cash out of my stock options. And of course, I have my salary. And in 5 years, I'm retired. I'm done, right?
It might not even take 5 years for them to destroy your company, though.
Right.
So I don't think that people were necessarily going in knowing that they were going to get screwed.
Right. But there's also then the Wall Street traders who were investing in things. And this is another thing where, like, I'm not saying that all Wall Street traders are bad or they're all greedy, but the way that they make money is typically they're getting like a percentage of your investment every year, right? So if you invest $1 million with some company, some stockbroker, they will get a percentage. If the value of your stock goes up, they get even more. If it goes down, they still get a cut. So the important thing to them financially is to just continue to get you to invest, right? So as long as they keep getting money to invest, they're going to make money. And it's not as important as whether their own individual investors and their 401ks were putting money. It doesn't matter what happens to them exactly. And like if they're moral, sure, that's the most important thing. But a lot of them are just like, well, this is about the money. And that has led, because there's so much of that, it's led to just this investment in China at all costs because it seems good on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the 401ks, like, I forget the guy who came up with this idea, but years ago, like there was all of this money sitting in U.S. pension funds and whatnot that was just kind of sitting there earning interest in banks. And there was the idea of like, oh, we can take this money and actually invest it in like China and create a lot more
like
money.
pension funds have invested in the stock market for
Right.
like that's not new, but yeah, the idea that like China is the place
Yeah,
to
to
invest.
then take and put it into China.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that Financial Times article about how it's hard to pull money out of China, a lot of those pension funds.
Right. So why is it hard to pull money out of China?
Well, it was interesting because it was partly blaming Wall Street for this, but I don't think that's the real fundamental reason. I mean, I think the real fundamental reason is that the CCP does not want you to be able to pull your money out of China. They want to keep that foreign investment circulating inside the country because that is what they depend on to keep their economy running.
Right. So they'll use various. I'm not sure if the capital controls necessarily apply.
The capital controls don't
those, but-
comply to foreign investors, but it's kind of like, well, let's say you came into China in a joint venture with a Chinese company, right? Maybe it's very hard for you to pull out of that joint venture.
Like you can't sell off your half of it or something.
Yeah, or if you sell it off, you're gonna like the JV company might buy you out at like a very low price.
Well, that's what happened to some Korean automakers, right? They kind of got screwed as they pulled out.
You like if you cannot like maybe you cannot pull your actual intellectual property out of China, like you're manufacturing whatever, like that's now not able to leave for various reasons.
Yeah. So in order to leave China, you have to basically take a big loss. It could be a loss of physical property. It could be a loss of capital. It could be a loss of intellectual property. Whatever it is. I mean, it could even be exit bans for some of your people. But
I mean, also there are things like if you've invested directly in Chinese companies, maybe you just can't get your money out, like
they just won't let you sell your stock.
or like what if you invested in bonds, right, for Evergrande or something like that?
Oh,
Like they're not going to pay those back. You're really screwed.
Yep.